All right, we're going to start on the issue of quantity and to what degree should you identify quantity in your solicitation. And we're going to go through 5 scenarios in terms of and the issue of quantity comes into play when you have units. So if you have unit, you'll define the unit, and now you have to make a determination relative to the quantity of the unit that you're going to obtain. And there's, again, 5 different scenarios. You can provide an exact quantity, and, well, I'll just exact minimum, maximum, range, and no guarantee. So I'll go through these one at a time. Exact quantity of units. If you are telling a vendor exactly how many units you're going to buy, you have a definite quantity contract. For a definite quantity contract, you can get a fixed price. Because if you defined the unit and you said we're going to buy 10 of these, you will have them give a price per unit, but you can multiply 10 times that and come to a definite price to get those 10. So you know what the contract should cost. Now there may be circumstances where they don't deliver all the units, either at all or the quality you want, in which case you have the unit price and you won't pay them. But if they do what they're supposed to, you know what you're going to pay and they know what they're going to get. So the vendors know what and how much to provide, so they may be able to quote a fixed price to do so. The only likely variable is when the purchase will be made, i.e. will they be bought at once, or will the purchase be spread out over a specified time frame? Will the purchase schedule be specified, or will the purchases be made on demand as needed? First or second day, I think we talked about the one example where an agency did a solicitation to buy a given quantity of an item, and they got a good price, and the item was delivered, and then they panicked because they realized they forgot to tell the vendor they only wanted them to deliver it in 4 separate shipments. So even if you define the unit and define how many you want, it's also important, if you don't want them at once, that you tell them either here's when you're supposed to give them to me, or we guarantee we're going to buy this number, but we're going to tell you and give you like 2 days notice of when we want a given quantity, but we'll buy this number over a period of time. So you can say that. That's an exact quantity. Unit pricing will be needed so that the payment can be made when units are received. The agency shouldn't pay for all units until all are received. These are principles of payment. The vendor probably wants some payment prior to all units being delivered. If the delivery is short of the specified quantity, or if some units are below the required quantity, payment should only be made for the units received that meet the required quality level. Unit pricing is needed to be able to do this. If you're getting it by units, you need to have pricing by units so you can take into consideration what happens if you don't get them, as I said, at all or to the quality, and that you don't pay for them until you get them. That's another aspect that we say in Perform. We should not be, and I think we actually say it in this class if we get to it, we should be paid after we get it, not before we get it. And so even if you're going to buy 12, if you only got 2 at this time, speaking of 2, the helicopters, since Gary brought that up, we're going to buy 6, but we're buying 2 a year for 3 years, I think it is, something like that. And they cost almost $12 million a piece. We have a unit price for the helicopters, but we don't want to pay for 6 helicopters if we're getting 2 in 1 year, 2 another year, 2 another year. We pay when we get it. When they make sure the helicopter measures up to all the performance standards, that's when they pay for it. Now the vendor, if they had their way, would be paying the $72 million up front. And we'd be taking the risk that we'd get what we wanted, when we wanted, how we wanted it. We don't work that way. We shouldn't be working that way. So we need unit prices. All right, minimum quantity of units. And I'm not telling you these things are going to come into play frequently, but I'm telling you you should think about it. If you're buying units, should you make a guarantee that says you will buy at least a given number of units? And we're going to go through what's involved. What that means, if you make a guarantee, even if you don't buy the minimum specified quantity, you're paying as if you bought the minimum specified quantity. And your first reaction is, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense. But it might. And we will demonstrate, maybe in the next slide or so, why that might make sense. So what you're doing automatically, as soon as you have, not knowing how many you're going to buy, it's an indefinite quantity contract. So if you know how many, it's a definite quantity contract, and you don't know how many, it's an indefinite quantity contract. Not rocket science. The minimum is known, but not the maximum. Again, it requires unit pricing, so payment can be made for the actual quantity purchased above the minimum guarantee. Above the minimum. If all you do is buy the minimum, you've already guaranteed what you're going to pay. But anything above that, you have to pay by unit. This is used when it is determined that the agency will receive a lower price than if nothing is guaranteed. Even if you pay for quantities you don't get, you're still better off than if you made no guarantee. With no quantity purchase amount, a vendor will quote a very high, will likely quote, may quote a very high price for each unit that is bought to cover all costs. It has to cover its costs. That's what a vendor is looking to do. The likelihood that the minimum level won't be reached, hence there will have to be payment for something that isn't received, needs to be considered, obviously, versus the likelihood that the anticipated lower unit prices will produce more savings than if no guarantee is made. Example. So here's an example. You want to buy widgets, with that magical thing, whatever a widget is. A vendor may quote a unit price of $100 per widget with no guarantee. So if you want to buy one, whatever you buy, if you've made no guarantee, it's $100 a widget. And it does that because it assumes that it's going to be like a onesie type of situation. If we price it per unit, because typically people only buy one unit. So that unit price has to cover our cost to produce, ship, etc., one unit. So that's why it's $100. Let's say in our example that an agency thinks it's going to buy 15 to 20 widgets. It doesn't know, but it thinks it's likely it's going to buy 15 to 20. And let's say the vendor's price list has a price break at 10. That if you buy at least 10, instead of being $100 a widget, it's $80 per widget. So what you do is do the math. If the agency guarantees it will buy at least 10, since it isn't a stretch, if you think you're going to buy 15 to 20, we think we're going to buy at least 10. So you're obligating at a 10 minimum to pay $800. That's the obligation if you guarantee at least 10. At the single price of 100, that would have bought 8 widgets. What's the likelihood, if you think you're going to buy 15 to 20, that you're going to buy at least 8? If the agency is convinced it will need at least 8 widgets, there is virtually no risk of losing money. In contrast, if the agency bought 15, the minimum it thought it was going to buy at 100 apiece, well, if it bought it at $80, that's $1,200. If it bought it at the 100 with no guarantee, it's $1,500. They'd be saving $300 by making a guarantee of 10 units. And they bought what they thought they were going to buy. If they bought 20, it'd be even more savings. So that just demonstrates you have to know what the pricing is, and you can make that decision. So sometimes it's going to pay you to make a guarantee, a floor. For 20 widgets, the savings will be $400. So you can do the math there. Maybe there was another price break at 20. Now here's where it gets more complicated. So yes, it's a no-brainer at 10. What if there's another price break at 20? And if the price break at 20 is $75, and that's per unit. So what you would do if you bought 20, savings would be $100 over buying 20 at the 10 unit price. In other words, 20 times, you're only saving $5 per widget versus the 10 guarantee. So that means if you bought all 20, you'd be saving $100, 20 times 5. So you have the potential benefit of saving $100 if you bought all 20. But if you did If you bought at least 19, it would pay to make that guarantee, but anything less than 19, you'd be losing money making a guarantee of 20 versus a guarantee of 10. So in that type of scenario, you would not make the guarantee for 20, you'd stay with the 10 guarantee. The 10 makes sense, the 20 doesn't. And it's all by math. So you simply look at the math and decide, do you make a guarantee? Now that's an easy example. And here we're saying if you bought 18, you'd be losing money. Occasionally, it may make sense to guarantee a maximum number of units that will be purchased. I'm going to get something else in a moment, but I'm going to go the opposite, minimum, maximum. Occasionally, it may make sense to guarantee a maximum. This may be advisable if there is scarcity of the item so that vendors know they only have to provide a finite number of the item, which is not the typical situation. And I've had this on a couple occasions where a vendor is willing to make a limited amount of sales at a limited price to get the purchase, but if they had to do that for everything they had to offer, they would not offer that price. So at times, unless you make a maximum guarantee, you may be pricing yourself, causing higher prices. It doesn't happen often, but it's a possibility. There's probably more reason to guarantee a minimum quantity purchase than a maximum, but sometimes a maximum may make sense. Quantity range of units, where you state both a minimum and a maximum. So you have to look at both issues relative to the minimum guarantee and the maximum guarantee and see if it makes sense to put the bookends on both quantity purchases, both a minimum and a maximum. Usually doesn't happen, but at least you can think about it. No guarantee, and this is what frequently we do. We say we make no guarantee of any minimum or maximum quantity of usage. That makes sense if we have a history and we can provide the history to the vendor so they can get a good idea of what we're going to use, or in particular, if it doesn't cost them anything to provide versus not provide. If they have no incurred expenses that they can only recoup by providing some kind of activity, then no guarantee may make sense. And again, if we have a history that shows we've used thousands of it, such as if you're buying laboratory tests or drugs at facilities, they know that you're going to buy large quantities. Even though you don't guarantee, you're going to almost certainly spend a lot of money with them, so there's no issue of not making a guarantee. But sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. If it is unknown if any units will be purchased or potential price breaks are at such high levels that it seems more likely to cost money than save money, the best approach might be to guarantee nothing and only pay if there is actual usage, albeit at a higher price, higher rate. Estimated quantity. Estimated quantity differs from the previous slides on indefinite quantity purchase in that for indefinite quantity purchase, the contractor is paid for each unit actually purchased at the quoted unit price. This is going to be confusing, so I'm going to read this and I'm going to say, now here's what this says. Because I can tell you're already confused. In estimated quantity procurements, there is a fixed price that does not vary with the exact quantity that adds up being provided. When estimating the quantity of goods or services to be purchased as a result of a solicitation, excuse me, it is necessary to provide the best available approximation of projected usage. And let me look at the next slide. Okay, let me read this, and then maybe this will explain it and I don't have to go back to it. It is also, if you have an estimated quantity, it is also required to include a variations in estimated quantity clause. This clause establishes a range within which the contractor's fixed price will apply. Generally, the default position is the range is 25% above and 25% below the estimate, i.e. from 75% of the estimate to 125% of the estimate, the fixed price applies. If the actual quantity used is outside this range, an equitable adjustment is made in the contractor's price. Now I may have more slides, but before I go any further and confuse you anymore, let me try to explain this. You have two types of indefinite quantity scenarios. The one quantity is where you have identified a unit and you're going to pay for each unit you use. So you're paying by unit. If you're paying by unit, the importance of guaranteeing a minimum or maximum only comes into play if you think you can get savings, as we did with our example, by making a guarantee. But the vendor is going to get paid for each unit it provides. In contrast to that, if they're giving you a fixed price, there's not a unit price involved. They're not getting paid according to the number of units they're providing. They have to do a job, and they have to do it for a fixed price. Now, if you have in that job said, we estimate that it's going to take X amount of something to do the work, and you're not guaranteeing anything, and they're not getting paid by unit, even though you have given an approximation, you are into an indefinite quantity contract with estimated quantities where you have to have this variation in estimated quantities. And let me give you an example where this might make more sense, because where this typically comes into play is construction. And if you're doing highway construction, and you say, all right, we want you to build a mile of road, and you're not just a generic mile of road, but it's a mile of road that's going to run from this point to this point. And we want this road to be virtually flat the whole way through. So that means in some places you're going to have to level off hills. In some places you're going to have to fill in depressions to keep this relatively level. And we estimate that you're going to have to remove a total of 1,000 cubic yards of material from elevated locations, and we estimate you're going to have to put in 5,000 cubic yards of fill, dirt, whatever, to fill in depressions. Give me a fixed price to build this 1 mile of road. So you have given them estimates of whatever I said, 1,000 cubic yards of adding and 5,000 cubic yards of taking away, or whatever I said, but you're saying, give me a fixed price. They're not getting paid for a cubic yard of dirt they remove. They're not getting paid for a cubic yard of dirt they put somewhere else. They're getting paid for the mile of road. That is a fixed price. That's where estimated quantity variation comes into play. And what the rule of thumb is, you have to, as an agency, have done a deliberate job of trying to identify the estimates you put in your document. That if you estimated 1,000 cubic yards removed and 5 cubic yards to be deposited, you actually went out and did some analysis. You looked at the location, you did measurements, you did your math with cubic yards, and you came up with something that you thought was a good estimate. And then, because things can always be different, you put in this variation, the 25% above or below. So if I estimate 1,000 cubic yards that need to be removed from the elevated locations, and I have a variation of 25% above and below, that means as long as the contractor removes at least 750 cubic yards and no more than 1,250 cubic yards, their fixed price is fixed. But if they remove 500 because you just thought they'd have to take something out, and when they got into it, realized that they didn't have to, or from the vendor standpoint, and if it's 500, we don't want to pay as much. We want to benefit from them doing less work. If the vendor has to put in 2,000 or remove 2,000 cubic yards, they don't want to do twice the work and not get paid any more money. So as soon as you're beyond the range that we have given for the variation, somebody's entitled to an equitable adjustment, which means either we're going to pay less or we're going to pay more. But that is if there is this fixed price scenario. So that is the exact opposite on paying on a unit price basis. On a unit price basis, if we say you'll get paid for each cubic yard you either add or remove, then if they do 2,000, they're happy because they're getting paid for 2,000 yards versus a fixed price and doing twice as much for the fixed price. So you have to, in planning, decide what type of situation do you have. Do you want a fixed price contract? Do you want a contract that's priced on unit prices? If it's unit prices, you have to identify it, define it, get a price for it, etc. So that's what we're trying to do in this comparison between going back to this slide, differs on whether it's an indefinite quantity contract where you're paying by the unit price versus a contract with a fixed price where we're just estimating what they have to do for that fixed price. The one way we pay by unit, the other way we pay a fixed price, possibly with an equitable adjustment. That's what those couple slides supposedly say. Now you can see clearly that that's what they say, right? After I've told you what they say. And even now you're still not sure. Here's the 75% above and below, and basically the example I said. The amount of the adjustment, if you have an equitable adjustment, if it's beyond the range, the amount of the adjustment will have to be negotiated between the parties. If agreement cannot be reached, someone's going to file a claim, typically the vendor, because we always have the upper hand. We're only going to pay what we think we should pay. So we always, if they think they should get more money, we don't pay for it, they file the claim. But that's what's going to happen when you're into that type of thing and you don't come up with an equitable adjustment that the contractor thinks is fair to them. And we certainly don't want to do an equitable adjustment we don't think is fair to the state. So we should only be in one where the vendor doesn't think they're getting enough money. If we don't think we're getting enough money, we shouldn't be paying for it. We shouldn't do what we don't think is appropriate for us. The requirement for a contractor to abide by a fixed price within the variation range only applies if the state made a conscious, rational projection of the estimated quantity. If the projection of usage is nothing more than a wild, unsubstantiated guess, the appeals board has upheld claims from vendors and required the state to pay for any variation from the estimate, even within the range. So what that says is, if you said, I think you'll have to remove 1,000 cubic yards from some places and put in 5,000 cubic yards in other places, and they had to remove 10,000 cubic and add 20,000 cubic, which had no relationship, and they come back and file a claim and you have to evidence why you came up to your estimate, and you sat back in your office and just said, all right, I have no idea, so I'll just put down 1,000 and 5,000. Didn't go out to the site, didn't try to make a conscious effort, the vendor's not going to be required to even stay within the 25% above and beyond range. They're going to get an equitable adjustment for every amount beyond the estimate. That may be confusing. It's something you're probably going to have to, if you think you're in this situation, go back and ponder this. So I'm just letting you know you have two things to consider. Whether you're doing an indefinite quantity contract with unit prices that are paying on a unit price basis, or whether you have a fixed price where you have estimated quantities, in which case you have to have a variation in estimated quantity clause, and you must identify what the fixed price is going to cover from the standpoint of the variation from the estimate. And even though the norm is 25% above and below, you can make it 10%, you can make it 20%, you can make it 30%. You can vary the variation estimate. You'll have to go back and think about it. Guaranteed quantity decision factors. If vendors have established list price, now we're going back to, now that I've sort of taken a detour onto this issue of variations in estimated quantities, I'm going back to the simpler issue we started before about paying per unit and the decision of, do you make a guaranteed minimum, since that's the most typical issue you will want to consider, and starting to tell you how you can make these determinations up front in your solicitation. And the easiest way is if vendors have established price lists. If you're buying a commodity and they have a national price list that says, and you can tell by simply looking at it and accessing it from the internet or wherever, that here's our prices per no quantity guarantee, here's our prices at the first price break, here's our price break at the second quantity, etc., and you can make your decision of whether it makes sense to do any minimum guarantees. So it's easy to see the price breaks when you have established price lists. Usually that won't be the case. It may be the case if you're buying equipment or something like that, but even if they have established price list, you hope they're going to bid lower than that. And you hope they're going to give you different quantity breaks than what's on their price list. So maybe you're into the unknown scenario of, I don't know whether I should make a guarantee or not make a guarantee. So how am I going to know if I don't have enough information to know that? When there is a competitive procurement, it isn't known in advance what vendors will bid at various quantities level. So how do I make a decision in a vacuum? Well, things don't usually happen in a vacuum, so you have to make sure you don't have a vacuum. All right, let's see. Have I jumped to? All right, I guess I haven't. So what we are, you have to look at the top line there. What the suggestion is, get prices for multiple quantities. If you don't know what you're going to order, one of the solutions so that you're not in that vacuum situation is have the vendor give you prices at different quantity levels, so that you don't have to know. All you do is you have these different price levels, and if it's in price level 1, you're going to pay that price. If it's a price level 2, you're going to pay a different price, etc. So let me start using the example from before and start fleshing in this scenario how you do it relative to the 15 to 20 and 10 widget purchases we described previously. So what you will do is require unit prices at the lowest level you're likely to purchase. We said previously, you know almost without a doubt you're going to purchase 10. So 10 will be your first purchase level. But then also request unit prices at higher quantity levels, such as 15, such as 20, and you reserve the right to establish the minimum quantity level after prices are open. You give me a price for 10, you give me a price for 15, you give me a price for 20, and after I see what the prices are, then I'll tell you which one I'm going to say I'm awarding at, the 10, 15, or 20 level. Advantages of this approach: affords the agency the maximum flexibility to determine what guaranteed level is likely to produce the lowest total price. Disadvantage: depending upon the guaranteed level, different vendors could be the lowest bidder. The result, and I'm going to go through this in a minute, the result could be a protest from a vendor that isn't selected, saying the agency only selected the guaranteed level to be able to award to that vendor. And what that means is if one vendor is the lowest price for a guarantee of 10, and another vendor is the lowest price for a guarantee of 15, and a third vendor is the lowest price for a guarantee of 20. If you, like the vendor, let's say, gave you the lowest price at 15, if you have reserved the right to make your decision after opening as what the quantity is, the claim can be that you are motivated not in what is the best interest of the agency, but simply because you like the vendor that gave the lowest price for 15, so you're going to make the quantity guarantee of 15. I'm not going to say that's typically going to happen. It's a possibility. And since it's a possibility, once you recognize something could happen, you can devise a way to avoid the possibility that that could happen. So I think I have done that. Let's see, disadvantages of this approach. Vendor A could have the lowest price for 10. I just said that. Which one should the agency choose for the award when it doesn't know how many units it will end up buying? I went the wrong way. Or it could be specified. This is the alternative to try to avoid having to decide. It could be specified that the award determination will be made based on the prices submitted, and so this is the alternative, and risk having to defend the decision or protest, vendor with the lowest average, or you could do something else. You can go to different scenarios. So you can say, we'll simply make a decision when we see what the prices are. That's one way. You could say in the solicitation, we will average the three prices, and we will make the award to the vendor that has the lowest of the three price average. So you're saying in advance how you're going to do it. That's going to encourage vendors to give lower prices for all three, so they come up with the lowest on the average. What that means is selection will be based upon price for a given level 10, but the selected vendor has to, or the third scenario is that you can say in advance in the solicitation that the award is going to be based on the lowest price for the minimum level, the 10. So that everyone knows that the 10 is what the award basis is going to be. But then they have to honor the prices for the 15 and 20 if those higher quantities are purchased. I.e., you're going to award it for 10, but if you end up buying 15, they have to give you the price that they quoted for 15, and if you end up buying 20, they have to give you the price that you quoted for 20, even though you've only guaranteed 10. So you can do a lot of variation in what you're doing here, but still the essence is you're giving yourself the maximum flexibility, and you're giving the vendors more idea of what they're going to get if they win an award and how you're going to make the selection. Another variation for how you can make the award. You can do weighting of prices. You can weight prices according to the likelihood you think you're going to make, you're actually going to buy those quantities. So you've already said through the various examples that you think without a doubt you're going to buy 10. So you can weight 10 at 50%. It's less likely you're going to buy 15. So 30% weight of the 15 price. It's even less likely you're going to buy 20, but it's still a possibility. So you can weight that at 20. So what that means, if you're weighting, you're going to take their actual unit price. So they're going to give you actual unit prices of all three of these quantities. And you're going to take their actual price for 10 and just multiply times 0.5 to get a weighted price. An actual price of 15 times 0.3 to get a weighted price, 20 price times 0.2 to get a weighted price, and you're going to add up those three prices, which probably I have on the next slide, and come up with a total, and then that will be a weighted or composite price per unit, and that will be the basis for the award. This is what many times is the best way to go. And let's see, yes, I have done the math for you. So let's say they have quoted $100 for 10, 80 for 15, and 75 for 20, as per the example we've been saying now for about 15, 20 minutes. 50 times 100 is $50, 30 times 80 is 24, 20 times 75 is 15. The weighted or composite price is $89. So you make the award to the vendor that has the lowest composite price based upon those weighting factors, 50, 30, 20, of the quantities we said, and they are to price it. What that does is encourage vendors to give you the lowest price at all three levels, since they know all three are going to go into the award determination, but it's going to tell them they're better off giving you the lowest price for the 10 because that's the one you're most likely going to buy. All this in the pricing class, we go over this to great extent. We spent 3 days talking about these types of scenarios. And actually, we did a pilot on this last year, and 3 days was, we had difficulty getting through it in 3 days, so it may end up being 4 days. It's 548 slides, something like that. But with lots of examples like this, that takes more time than just reading through a slide. Let's see. All right. So that's just giving you some of the things just having to do with quantities and units. Any questions on that issue?
One question. On that road example,
yes.
Why would you even bother with the fill and cut? You just say, I want a road go from point A to point B at a certain level, and that's it. And then they give you a fixed price because they're going to do the evaluation.
His question is, why would you bother to give them any estimate? Just say, here's where I want the road. You go out and make all your estimates, etc., and give me a fixed price. Maybe that's appropriate, but maybe they found through just experience that they do a better job of estimating, and they have too many issues with vendors coming in for contract claims and various things, and too much variation. And so they've determined that it makes more sense for them to do some of these projections than just let it totally up to the agency, to the vendor. But that's a determination they have to make. It's the issue of risk. If the state makes the estimate and it's a variation in an estimated quantity scenario, the risk, if they have an estimated properly is on the state. If you just tell them, give me a price for a road, then the risk is on them. But if they don't do a good estimate, they may end up pricing higher than what they'd have priced if you do the legwork and the preparation. All things you need to think of, because you have a great deal of flexibility. There's a tremendous amount of variation and flexibility that you have. Usually we don't agonize over every possible scenario because we do what typically we've done before, but the other thing we say is don't just do that and don't think beyond doing that. Think about the fact you have this flexibility in other areas, and does it make sense to bring some of these other examples or possibilities into play in something you've done differently previously. So just letting you know what the possibilities are. We're going on to monitoring contractor performance, which is primarily in the Perform class. The topics and issues discussed in this section are also discussed in the 5-day Perform class, usually in much greater detail with examples. And I don't know whether the 5-day Perform class is going to be the same way as the 5-day Planning class, or whether it's going to end up not being done in 5 days. That's why that's going to be kind of like a pilot as well to see. And just when we do planning again, we've already determined it's going to be scheduled as a 6-day class. So anyone who takes it in the future, they're going to sign up for 6 days. And planning Perform, we'll see whether 5 is enough or whether that will be a 6-day class in the future. Writing specifications, monitoring performance. How do you know that, and I've mentioned this a number of times already, but now I'll mention it a little more detail. How do you know when the vendor is adhering to the contract requirements? This is essential in terms of seeking to invoke bonds or liquidated damages, making or withholding payment, pursuing default. You can only do these things if you know whether the vendor is performing. So you have to have a means to tell whether the vendor is performing. Let's see. Are the costs to the contractor for monitoring activities such as reports, meetings, independent audits, independent validation and verification to be included in the base price or separately billed? These are things that you need to think about. These are things you need to put in your specification. If you say there will be 12 meetings a year, except you're not guaranteeing that 12 will be the only number of meetings. There might be more or less. Are you going to tell the vendor the meetings are a fixed price in their overall price bid, or are they going to be allowed to bill per meeting? They're going to be allowed to bill for audits, things of this nature. You have to tell them whose price, what they have to calculate within their price. Excuse me. Should the specifications state objective performance measures and standards and the instruments to measure the performance? If you have objective standards, you have to have an objective means to measure performance to see if those standards are achieved. Example, are there applicable industry standards? If though, these standards should be specifically referenced in the specifications as being the required level of performance. Should there be written reports? And I'm going to go through these in some detail. If so, all of these issues should be addressed. When you're writing your specifications, when you're saying the reports, you should think of each of these factors in saying what is to be done and what is to be done within either the fixed price the vendor gives or what is to be done under a unit price that the vendor can charge. So you should know and should state the purpose of the report. I have had situations where I have reviewed specifications for agencies, and I have just gone down and I've seen things that I've deemed a little bit problematic, so I've gotten to the thing that they're requiring reports, and I scratch my head and I say to myself, what are the report going to do? Reports don't seem to be appropriate for what's being specified. So I asked the agency, all right, what do you want this report for? And I have gotten answers, well, that was in the previous specs that I used to start with. Okay, so the previous specifications, i.e. the current contract, requires reports. Yes. Who gets them? I don't know. Does anybody get them? I don't know. So you don't know whether the vendor's even giving you the reports, you don't know if anyone's getting the reports, you don't know if anyone's using the reports, and if you don't know that, it kind of seems like the reports have no meaning. So if you can't come up with any reason to get a report, and you can't tell me any reason to require it other than it was in the specs I started with, perhaps you don't need reports. And sometimes when I've said that to people, just like, wow, that makes sense. Well, thanks, I'm glad. At least something I say makes sense. On the other hand, if they come up and give me a very detailed, well, here's what we want to know with this report, etc., then I might say, all right, then have you identified any of these things? Now you've said why a report is necessary, but you haven't given these other important details which a vendor is going to have to know and you're going to have to know relative to pricing. So now you need to start going into who's going to get it? Who's going to use it? Well, again, they've told me the purpose, the audience, the use. What's going to be in it? You want to make sure you get a report that's going to be useful. So you're going to tell them, at least at a minimum, what the report has to cover. Often the format is going to be hard copy, or more particularly, it's going to be electronic, it's going to be in Word, it's going to be in Excel, it's going to be in Access, it's going to be in some format, it's going to be compatible with the Medicaid information system, or it's going to be compatible with something for ADAA. If that's what you want, this report to fit into something and be able to be downloaded or compatibility, you need to say it. If you don't say it, and you go to a vendor afterwards and say, wait a minute, you're giving me the report, but it isn't compatible with our system. And they come back and say, you never said that in the specs. Here's the added cost that I need to charge you to make it compatible. You don't want to get in that situation. So tell them, format. Tell them to move slides when you don't want them. Format, number of copies if it's going to be hard copy. Is it going to be 10? Is it going to be 20? Is it going to be hardbound? Is it going to the legislature? Is it going to the governor's office? What's the purpose of this report? How frequently are they to give you reports? Weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, once at the end of the contract? Makes a difference whether they're doing it weekly versus quarterly versus once a year. Tell them how frequently. And when. I've seen it where you're supposed to have 4 reports. Okay, can they give you one today, one tomorrow, one the next day, one the next day? Or can they give you one 4 days before the contract ends, one 3 days before the contract ends, one 2 days before the contract ends, and one on the last day of the contract? And the answer is always going to be, oh no, we want it equal spaced. Well, then say it. When do you want it? And maybe it's a specific time frame, or maybe it's triggered by some occasion. When something happened, that's when the report is supposed to be produced within 10 days of that occurrence, or within 10 days of the end of the quarter. Tell them. So again, this is kind of like a checklist. Purpose, audience, use, content, format, number of copies, frequency, and timing. Those should all be described when you're saying a vendor should do reports. And by doing the first 3, you're going to know whether you go any further and even require the report. Purpose, oh, I'm going to do some more detail on this. Okay. Sometimes it makes sense that I should read these things before I do them, because sometimes it's months between I write them and then I present them. Why is a report needed? How will it be used? The audience, who should the report be submitted to? Who will read the report and benefit from it? The answers to these questions will help with the issues on the following slides, or the answers may evidence that no one needs or reviews the report, in which case it shouldn't be required. Content, what information should be included? Should the information be for both? And these are other things you should describe. The current reporting period and cumulative. So it's one thing to say we want to report, but does that report just for what happens in the month of October? Or is it we want a report for the month of October, and then we want you to take the results from October and add it to the results of January through September and give us a cumulative report for now the first 10 months of the 10 calendar year. It makes a difference. Format, electronic, hard copy, both, specific software, number of copies, etc. Frequency, should it be due quarterly, monthly? I said that. As needed, as we talked about, I think on Monday, is ambiguous, should only be used if there is a maximum number of times the report could be required, or the vendor can charge for reports in excess. We mentioned that back when we were talking about the as-needed scenario on those slides. So you can say, if you say, give us a report as needed, you should go further, bless you, and say, we will require at least 6 reports a year, or no, not at least, no more than 6 per year. Then the vendor's going to price to 6. If you want as needed, we will do at least 6, and we will pay you for any beyond 6. If we need 7, 8, 9, 10, we'll pay you a fee. You will have that as a unit. You will have a price for that unit. And if you want 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., they've included the first 6 in their fixed price. You will pay for any beyond that. That could be a way that you handle if you don't know how many you're going to need. But the more information you give vendors, the better they can do their pricing. Timing, when is it due? By a given day of the month, within the time frame of some event. Frequently we'll say MBE reports are due by the 10th of the month following the month for which the information is being reported. So it's due by the 10th of the month following the month. Or is it due within 10 days of the accomplishment of deliverable number 1? We need a report on all aspects of deliverable 1. You're going to describe the time frame. Always include the right to require changes or the revisions. Just because they give it to you doesn't mean it's going to make any sense. Vendors at times will give you reports that, number 1, aren't real clear what they're saying. Number 2, might have a lot of typographical errors and a lot of problems with the use of the English language, so that you would be embarrassed to even provide that report to the public, to the legislature, to the governor's office, etc. So you want the ability to read it, and you reserve the right to go back to them and say, if we tell you to make changes, make changes. And if you do that, give them a time frame when they have to make the changes. So they could have met the first time frame. You go back and say make changes, and then a month later you're still waiting for the changes that you expected within 5 days. But you never said that. So say it. So that's reports. Same concept with meetings, and this is something that's more likely to happen even than the reports probably. Purpose. Why is there a meeting? And if you can't think of a purpose, don't have it. Let me see if I'm doing the same thing. Am I going through these one? Okay. So just read it and then I'll go through these. Purpose, mandatory and optional attendees, location, option to conduct electronically, frequency, duration, minutes, the right to require unscheduled meetings because of performance issues. Now we'll deal with them one by one. Purpose. The typical purposes for a meeting are to review the progress status of the contract, allow real-time discussion of issues and decision-making. Progress, make decisions. Based upon the progress or the lack of progress, based upon what the vendor's telling you or other circumstances, we're going to decide, what do we do in the future? Do we have variation to direct you still within the contract, or do we need to do a contract modification to do something different? So you're doing real-time adjustments. If a particular contract does not require real-time direct interaction with the state and contracting personnel, i.e. if reports, complaints, or direct observation provide sufficient contract status information, don't require meetings or only require infrequent meetings. All right, so I tripped over that, so I'll read it again. if a particular contract does not require real-time direct interaction of state and contractor personnel, if you don't really need to meet with them at a given frequency, if you're going to get reports, or if you know, without a doubt, if the vendor's not performing, you're going to get complaints, and you can tell from the complaints whether the vendor's performing. Or if the vendor's working on your work site, and you can simply look and see whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. Like, are they cleaning the floor? You don't need a meeting to see whether they're cleaning the floor, because you can walk down your floor and see whether it's clean. So you may not need meetings, or you may not need frequent meetings, so maybe you'll have a minimum number just so that you get together every now and then. Needs to be considered. Mandatory and optional attendees, and this is almost never specified unless you've heard me tell you you should do it, and then people do it after I tell them they should do it. Who from the contractor staff must attend? And almost no one on their own thinks of this, but I've had many times when you have a meeting, the vendor has to attend the meeting, and like one person shows up, not a person you thought that you know isn't not integral to the contract, and it's like, where's the contract manager? Where's the regional person? Well, they didn't come. Well, why didn't they come? Well, they sent me. Well, but you don't know anything. Well, they sent me. Well, you're not enough. I want them. Well, they sent me. There's nothing in the contract that says they're supposed to come. They aren't coming. If you want them to come, I'm sure we'll be able to work out some price adjustment to get them here the next time. And that's what it's always going to come down to. If it's anything of significance that has a price aspect to it, and you have not specified it, a vendor is going to come and say, pay me the money and we'll give it to you. But if you don't pay the money, we won't give it to you. More money than what they have quoted. So which of the vendor staff must attend all meetings? Generally, you want to say their contract manager should attend all meetings. If this is anything significant, you want their key person, and maybe you'll go beyond that. Maybe you will tell them that for maybe the normal monthly meeting is just the contract manager has to be there, but at a quarterly meeting, we want the contract manager and the regional manager. And the annual meeting, we want other people. So tell them who must attend all, certain, or meetings when requested. So it's in your specification. By specifying this in the solicitation, the contractor cannot legitimately claim that certain of its staff is not available, and that's the other thing that always comes up. Well, they're in California. They can't get back here for this meeting, so they just can't be here. Whereas if you had established the meetings, the dates of the meeting, and who was supposed to attend, you don't want to hear that. Or that its price did not include the number of meetings or the number and types of attendees. So those are things you don't want to hear. Location. This is something that typically is overlooked. Where is the meeting going to be? And sometimes you will want to say a specific address. Sometimes you just want to give a general address, but you don't want the situation that just says there will be quarterly meetings, and comes time for the quarterly meeting and the vendor says, okay, we've arranged for the meeting to take place in our offices. We're in Chicago. When you get here, we'll bring you in. And you say, wait a minute, we're not going to Chicago. It's a quarterly meeting. You're supposed to do it here. Well, there's nothing in your specifications that says it's supposed to be there. We assumed it was going to be at our offices because we're the ones that have the information you want to know. So it's easier for you to come to us with the information right here than for us to go to you. And besides, our price did not include us going to Maryland for these meetings. You don't want that. So you say where the meeting's going to be. 45 Calvert Street, Department of Budget Management, a meeting in the Baltimore-Annapolis area. You don't have to nail down specifically, but they know Baltimore-Annapolis isn't Chicago. So you've given them a parameter, even though it's not an exact parameter. Eastern Shore, contractor's office. Just say where it's going to be. By specifying the vendor cannot claim its price didn't include meeting at the noted location, or the absence of an identified location could be construed by vendors to mean anywhere within the boundaries of Maryland, and they could charge higher prices because of not knowing specifically where they have to go. The more information you give them, the better. Option to conduct meetings electronically, and this is an option at your discretion. Lots of times meetings can be held by phone or video conferencing or something like that. So if you have a situation where your anticipated vendors are located in Texas, in California, in somewhere else, and there's going to be a lot of expense for them to physically come to a meeting here, and you don't want to go there, maybe you can have an option for video conferencing. So if you have the capacity for video conferencing, at the agency's option, all or specified meetings might be conducted electronically. This potentially can save a lot of money for the contractor for travel expenses. Hopefully the savings will reflect in the contractor's price. Or there can be a separate amount quoted by vendors that will be deducted from the contractor's invoice for each electronic meeting. So you can say in your specifications, if we agree that a quarterly meeting will be maybe conducted electronically, we will deduct $200 from the vendor's price due that month. You're not asking them for a price for the meeting, you're just telling them what you're going to deduct, because it's all known. Or if you want to, you can have price per meeting, so it's known if you do electronically, you won't pay that price. Considerations that you should address. Frequently, state how frequently meetings will or may be held. A minimum or maximum number of meetings or both can be specified if the specific date of any meeting was not known in advance, and this is seldom done. Provide the reasonable advance notice that will be provided for the meeting. If I'm not telling you in advance, in the solicitation, when the meetings are going to occur, or have not in some mechanism established in advance when they're going to occur, I need to give you some reasonable notice to say, okay, here's when it's going to be. I shouldn't just contact you today and say, Monday, I want a meeting. Is that fair to the vendor? And lots of times you're going to hear me talk about vendors and the things we don't want them to do and the things we need to control them for and about. But the other thing that I say, hopefully, at least occasionally, is we have to be fair. We have to do what's reasonable for them, because reasonable for them always should come back to a better price for us and a better management of a contract. So if a vendor thinks it's a two-way street and there's reasonableness, give them some minimum. We'll give you at least 3 days notice, or 5 days notice, or something, so they know what the parameters are. Allow the state to determine the number of meetings when the number is variable, if a given meeting can be canceled as being unnecessary. You can say that even though the meeting is scheduled, we can just tell you we don't think it's necessary and you don't have to come. So that's another thing you should address. Duration. This almost never is identified, so I'm telling you, you should. State the typical meeting duration. Example, the contractor should allow a minimum of 1 hour or 2 hours for each meeting. So they don't come in and 20 minutes later saying, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be somewhere else in a half hour. I was only thinking this would take 15 minutes. I can't stay for something that looks like it's going to go 1 to 2 hours. If you said expect 1 hour or expect 2 hours, you're never going to want to hear that, and you shouldn't hear that, because they should have expected that and put it in their price. It might also be prudent to state a maximum duration of a meeting except under extraordinary circumstances, that unless there's performance problems, it will be no longer than 2 hours. State which contractor personnel must attend for the full meeting versus staff that might only attend a specific segment. So-and-so needs to be there for at least the first half hour or first hour. Contract manager needs to be there for the full duration. Such information helps prevent the vendor from claiming its price didn't include the meeting taking as long as it might and having the people stay there. Minutes. Another thing frequently never mentioned, but you want to have minutes of meetings, because without minutes, what inevitably happens is if you have a meeting 1 month and then a meeting a month later, the first thing you do is, all right, what did we decide the last time? And I've done it myself, and I've said to myself, I don't need to write things down because I will have no problem remembering all these things we agreed to. And then a month later, when I've had 20 other things that have happened in the meantime, It's, gee, I really thought I was going to remember what we agreed to, but now I'm not sure what we did agree to. And the thing that's even worse is when everyone else says the same thing. Well, I don't either. Didn't you agree to do this? No, I didn't agree to do that. Well, no, the state agreed to, no, we didn't agree to that. And so you start rehashing and you waste time. So someone needs to take minutes. And it should be stated in the solicitation who that somebody is. If it's the vendor, they need to have that. They need to anticipate doing it. They need to have it in their price. If it's you, you need to know that when there's a meeting, you're going to have someone there taking minutes because it's your responsibility. The minutes should record what was discussed, what was decided upon, who was responsible, what actions are to be done, who agreed to it, who was there and agreed to those actions. So they can't say, the vendor can't say, wait a minute, who committed us to that? Here's who committed you to that. It's your regional vice president. You've heard of him before, right? He has a little bit of authority within your organization versus, gee, who was at that meeting? I don't remember. And it becomes more important when it's a meeting that happened 6 months ago rather than a month ago. That you can go back to those meetings, and if there's performance problems, you can go back to the meetings and you can get the commitments, as long as other things that hopefully I've described here take place. And if I haven't described it here, I will describe it here, plus I describe it in perform, if you got all that. The solicitation should state who will be responsible for taking minutes, state of the contractor, prevent future billing issues. Require the minutes to be, yes, I have said what I want to say. Completed in a given format agreed to by the state. So you're going to tell them if the vendor is taking the minutes, what's supposed to be in the minutes, the format of the minutes, etc. Completed within a given time frame, within 3 days, within 2 days, by the next day. So they can't give you something 2 weeks later or a month later where they're giving you the minutes at the next meeting and you've never reviewed them to see whether they make sense. Circulated to the key attendees for comments and concurrence. And this is important. You want them to agree that, yes, this is what we agreed to. You want them to sign in some manner, electronically, hard copy, concur that, yes, the minutes fully reflect what was agreed at that meeting. And if they don't agree what is in the minutes, then you bring it up right then and there. Wait a minute, no, that's not what we agreed to. And you hash out what you agreed to, or you note the exception or something. But you don't continue on the basis that something was agreed to if the parties won't say in writing that that's what they agreed to. Again, you require written confirmation as accepted or accurate, and this is what you can rely upon in the future. If you now have contract performance and they say we never agreed to that, you can go back to the minutes, you can go back to the fact that someone in their firm agreed to those minutes, and that somebody was in the position of authority to have agreed, and then you can hold them to it. So these are not trivial issues depending upon what type of activity is being performed. Reserve the right to require unscheduled meetings because of performance issues. It's one thing to say monthly meetings, it's another thing if they're messing up. You don't want to wait till the next month to discuss a problem because the vendor's not performing. So you reserve the right for performance issues to have unscheduled meetings, and you will say that the vendor may not bill for unscheduled meetings because of performance shortcomings. You might give some parameters of where the meeting would be or could be held. You might state how much notice, but the notice could be proportional to the severity of the problem. If it's a disaster, we want you here tomorrow. If it's a semi-disaster, we might give you 2 days. But it doesn't have to be the same information as for regularly scheduled meetings because it's only happening because they're not performing. We're going to something else now. Formal periodic performance of evaluation. So these are all elements of monitoring performance of a vendor. Subjective scorecard. Excuse me. So you can have a formal evaluation, and we discuss it more in perform, where you do it monthly or quarterly and come up with a scorecard, the vendor pass, are they good, fair, excellent, terrible, whatever. If these will be used, how frequently? Who will do them? Are they supposed to self-critique? Are you going to critique? Are you going to have a third party do the scorecard? Going to come in and doing an audit or something like that? What is to be evaluated on this scorecard? Will the contractor be permitted to participate in design and content of the evaluation? The contractor should be required, if this is done, should be required to acknowledge receipt, should be required to provide a remediation plan for subpar performance. If the scorecard says that you are in poor, maybe even fair, you will need to give us a remediation plan for getting into the good range by the next evaluation. All this should be in your specification. Permitted to contest the evaluation by providing a rebuttal for anything it doesn't agree with. At times, the state isn't fair. I know that. There are times we have unreasonable expectations. There are times that one of the examples I'm going to give in the Perform class is when the state went to a vendor and wanted them to do something that was totally outside the scope of the contract. And they expected the vendor to do it simply because they needed it done. And the vendor had a problem with doing it because it was going to cost it more money and it was outside the scope of the contract. It didn't contract to do what the state's contract monitor wanted them to do. State's contract monitor sort of got an attitude against the vendor for not doing what the contract monitor wanted to do. So in that situation, the contract monitor can say, vendor doesn't live up to my expectations, not doing what I want them to do, etc. And if that's the only story you hear, it's a bad vendor. But when you hear the vendor side of, well, no, everything that I contracted to do is being done, and there's no contest that what I've contracted to do is being done. It is the things over and above what the contract required that I'm not doing. That makes a whole different situation. So you give the vendor the right, if they don't agree with the evaluation, to put in a rebuttal, and you keep the rebuttal so you have both sides. The contractor's rebuttal should be maintained in the agency file, the same as the agency's own evaluation, and this goes back to your issue of evaluations. If you get a request from other agencies for this type of information, if you have the evaluation and the vendor has signed off to every evaluation, you can give those evaluations. If the vendor has contested it, you should give their rebuttal along with your evaluation to another agency so they have both sides of the story. So that's the fair thing to do. That's what you should be doing. Independent audit. Should there be a requirement for the vendor at its own expense to have an independent audit or an independent verification and validation, IV&V, conducted, and I guess of should be on. Well, maybe it should. Conducted of some or all, of is okay. Conducted of some or all aspects of the performance. That's something you don't want to come up with after the fact. You should specify. If so, there needs to be a described mechanism for how the audit or IV&V will be independent despite the fact the contractor is the entity that hired the vendor, auditor, and will pay for the audit or IV&V. This could be an evaluation factor for an evaluated procurement. We require you to have your work audited once a year. You will obtain the audit vendor. You will pay for the audit vendor. You will describe how you will make sure that you will not influence the audit that is provided to the state by simply saying you will come up with a good report or you won't be used again. What's the firewall to maintain the independence of the entity doing the auditing? Or instead of telling the vendor that they must do this, say you either will or reserve the right to do an independent audit or IV&V conducted of some or all aspects of the contractor's performance. And if so, if you do conduct it by the state so that you don't have the issue of independence of the auditor or the contractor, will you bill the auditor or will you tell the contractor to bill your contractor for the expense, or will the state pay for it? needs to be in the specifications. If so, if you're expecting the vendor to pay for it, even though you obtained the other auditor, etc., the cost limitations must be contained in the specifications so vendors can include the cost in their price. If an independent audit IV&V is to be done, the agency must have a means to obtain the auditor. Usually this means there will be a procurement. Or you could use the DBM audit contract, or you can use CATS. So sometimes you'll simply do a task order to get an auditor or an IV&V contractor, if the state's going to provide that activity. These things should be addressed. They're part of monitoring the performance of a contractor. And most contract performance activities need to be in your specifications in advance. Personnel qualifications. Personnel qualifications should be specified in the solicitation in terms of required licenses or certifications and or required levels of education, general experience, specific experience such as minimum dollar value of accounts handled, number of staff supervised, specific activities performed. I'm trying to get through personnel before lunch. Any permissible equivalence of different factors should also be specified in terms of substituting education or certification for experience and vice versa, experience for education or certification. Example, an advanced degree beyond the required level of education can substitute on a year-for-year or other basis for the specific required duration of experience, or for a position, example, for a position requiring a bachelor's degree and 5 years of experience, a master's degree is acceptable as a substitute for 2 years of the required experience, or a doctorate can substitute for 4 years. So you're taking a bachelor's with 5, and you're saying if you have a master's, you can have less experience. If you have a doctorate, you can have even less experience. But you still have to, even with a doctorate, have at least 1 year, because you can eliminate 4 of the 5, which means there still has to be 1. You need to address equivalence if you're going to allow it. Or a CPA can substitute for 1 year of experience if it has to do with auditing. Any permissible equivalence of different factors should also be specified in terms of the opposite, experience for education or certification. Additional specific experience beyond what is required for the position can substitute on a year-for-year or other basis for a specified level of education or certification. Example, if a position requires 4 years of experience and a master's degree, a person with a bachelor's degree and 6 years of experience is accepted as equivalent. That's just an example. For either type of equivalent, state if there is an absolute minimum for which there is no substitute. Example, for a position requiring a bachelor's degree and 3 years of experience, even someone with a doctorate must still have at least 1 year of experience, where someone that has a high school graduate with 20 years of experience cannot substitute for a position requiring a master's degree and 2 years experience. So what you can substitute for and what you cannot substitute for. Substitution of personnel to avoid bait and switch situations. Bait and switch means they, in their proposal, say it will give you the identification of Tom Jones or Mary Adams, and give you Mary Adams has 20 years of experience and she's done all this work, and so they identify Mary Adams as a typical person that they might provide to you. They do not commit necessarily to Mary Adams. They just show Mary Adams is one of our employees and here's Mary Adams' experience. And then you contract with them because you have Mary Adams in your brain and you're thinking Mary Adams is who you're getting, and they give you Tom Jones. And Tom Jones has 2 years of experience and has never done anything like what you want your project to be. And you say, wait a minute, you said you would give us Mary Adams. And they said, no, we gave Mary Adams' resume as an example of the personnel that we might give you. And we didn't in the final analysis. We didn't violate anything. You don't want that type of situation. So to avoid that, for the most part, it should be required in your solicitation that personnel identified by an offeror in his proposal should actually be provided if the offeror is selected for award, as long as those persons continue to work for the offeror. Obviously, you can't stop them from quitting or having accidents or whatever, but as long as they are employed by the vendor, that you are contracting with, you can say, you give me who you identified in your proposal. I don't want bait and switch. Yes?
So for personnel, what you didn't say, and what I assume you meant to say, is that you should give a list of core personnel and then their educational responsibilities that are required for this.
You will
contract.
decide whether it is important to you for them to identify specific personnel that they will devote to the project, and if that is important, you will give them whatever you want as a minimum in terms of education, experience, etc., and you will say, once you describe these people in your proposal, and we accept them by not contesting that in the evaluation stage and asking you to provide different people, and we contract with you, we expect to get the people that you put in your proposal. So you will say all that. Once personnel begin working under a contract, as long as they continue to work for the contractor, they should only be permitted to be reassigned from the state contract with the permission of the state, once an acceptable substitute is approved by the state. And for all substitutions, it should be specified that the replacement should have qualifications at least equal to those of the person being replaced, and you should deal with unanticipated personnel changes, such as a person stops working for the contractor, dies. Contractor should be required to provide a replacement who is acceptable within a given period of time, such as 15 days. And here's other unacceptable, unanticipated circumstances where they should be required to come up with a replacement within a given time frame. So there can be many instances where it isn't as simple as they either reassign someone or they quit. If they're injured, if they end up being sent to jail and can't work. A whole slew of things can prevent someone from working on the job, and you should specify in advance when substitute has to be occurred, plus when you are unsatisfied with the performance and you're telling the vendor they must substitute someone. And we have, I guess we're supposed to have a handout of the personnel substitution clause that we have come up with. I didn't give it to you. You're supposed to have a handout. We have come up, DBM has come up with a 1.5 page, I know it's 12 o'clock. A couple minutes after? 2 after. We have a clause that we will send Gary that, or he already probably should have somewhere, that goes through all the variations we have discussed in the prior slides. So with that, see you around 1 o'clock.